Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be looking at the macro level trend line that we've been looking at before for the duration of the market cycle and see where we currently are. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. Also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So we did a video on this trend line a long time ago, and it's probably been like 5 or 6 months since we did this analysis. But the general idea is, there's this trend line that we can more or less say we've interacted with several times throughout the historical Bitcoin price movements. Okay. And we can look at it and say, well, the first peak we went just above it. When we had our double top peak, we sort of came back down to it. During the last cycle, we were just right on top of the line for, a decent part of the cycle. Here, again, we came back to the line. Again, we were riding this line for several months, okay? And since 2013 even, any time that we're on the line or under it, historically, it's a great time to get into Bitcoin. And obviously the line continues to increase as we continue on and push higher throughout the price discovery phase of Bitcoin. Now, the question is, well, we've gotten a decent level of extension from this line at the present time, okay? And one thing to note is that last cycle we rode this line for a fairly decent amount of time. If we were to take a date range, and say we were basically on top of this line from this point until this point, plus or minus a few percent, what's a few percentage points among friends? We were on this line for about 805 days. This cycle, so far, we were on it for about 119 days or so, and then we pushed up, and then we came back down to it, and we were on top of it more or less for another 343 days. So if we were to add, let's say, approximately 340 to 120, that's 460. So approximately 460 days on the trend line this cycle, last cycle, 805 days. Now, the first thing we should say is that just because we were on it for 805 days last cycle does not mean we'll have to be on it for that amount of time this cycle. Each cycle has interacted with this line in a very different way. The first cycle, it was ultimately just over the peak. The second cycle, it was just a test before running up to a new peak. The third cycle, it was our accumulation phase. The fourth cycle, we've been bouncing off of it, right? We haven't actually spent nearly as much time on it. At the end of the day, this is an imaginary line. Okay, and we need to reiterate that. At the end of the day, this is an imaginary line, and Bitcoin really doesn't care what lines we like to draw on the chart. But we just want to look at it for reference because, well, let's look at 2019. We were overextended from this line by a decent percentage point. If you go to 2019 and look to see how far we were extended above it, a modest 222% at the peak. And then if you go to the present time and look to see how far we were extended above it at the peak, a modest 222%. Basically the same level of extension from the trend line in 2019 and in 2021. So we want to maintain some level of pragmatism here because we don't yet know, I think Bitcoin is more or less at a crossroads. At some point, I would imagine if this trend sort of continues, that at some point we would go off the trend line and we would not return to it for quite some time. Eventually, I imagine this trend line will become resistance in the distant future because it's not like it's going to keep going up at this rate forever. Because again, the first cycle it went above it. The second cycle it just tested it as support. The third cycle it was support a long time. The fourth cycle, I think we still have a ways to go before we can definitively say what this cycle will bring. But if we continue with this line of thought, what would it look like for us to come back down to this trend line? Is it possible for us to come back down to this trend line? Or is this the point where we blast off into and put in our market cycle peak sometime this year? Okay, so we're going to look at a couple different scenarios. So the first scenario is the bullish scenario. So let's first start with the most bullish possibility that I could foresee, and we've drawn this before on the channel. We're going to take two bar patterns, okay? The first bar pattern will be a bullish case, and the second will be a bearish case. This way we've considered both possibilities. You understand the risks involved. So the first one, what we're going to do is we're going to measure this a bar from the bottom to the peak of last cycle, and then just overlay it with the current cycle. It looks something more or less like that. Okay, and you can see that if you overlay the cycle, we're actually ahead of schedule compared to the last cycle. If you just compare the last cycle, the ROI that we saw in the amount of time that we saw it, this cycle right now is actually ahead of schedule. So if you think that we will track this, then this would obviously be a very bullish perspective to have, right? This would be a bullish perspective to say, okay, at the very least, we'll track it. Therefore, it'll ultimately take us up to, around $300,000. I don't think we're gonna go to $300,000 in 11 months. I would love to be proven wrong. If we're at a $300,000 Bitcoin in 11 months, then I'm sure many of us will be very happy. This is the bullish case. And even if you don't think we'll make it to 300, let's suppose that we have a more realistic target and say it's 100K, which would basically be this point. So if we were to go up to 100K by the end of 2021, then then we put in our market cycle peak, and then we came back down to earth for a year or two, and then continued on, we would at least say that we experienced diminishing returns, because going from, say, 3K to 100K is only around 33x, whereas the last cycle we put in 100x from market cycle bottom. So this would be the bullish perspective. Okay, now, do we do ourselves any favors by not considering bearish perspectives? And I think this is the thing that people really, they struggle with, because they don't necessarily want to think of a bearish perspective, and then it ultimately can bite them. So we just want to present a bearish perspective as well, just so we have our ducks in a row. Well, the first one we already showed, right? The first one we already showed, and that's basically the fact that as measured from the trend line, in 2019, we got above 224% above it. And then in 2021, we also got about the same level of extension above it. Obviously, earlier it was even identical. It depends on how accurately you draw it, but approximately 225% above it. So the idea that we can't come back down might be a little bit misguided, because, well, we bumped off this line before and we ultimately came back down. So what if we just do it again? And what if this cycle is just remembered as a cycle that just keeps doing this nonsense, and it just keeps coming, up and back, something like that, okay? So what we want to do is we'll take another bar pattern, but this time we're going to take it from our present cycle to just show you what this might look like. So the first thing we can do is just draw a trend line here. And let's connect these peaks. And you can see this might be a channel. This might be our ultimate bull market channel for this market cycle. And the idea could be, well, maybe this was a peak, and then a local peak, and then a local bottom, and then this one capitulated below it. So what if we were to take a bar pattern and overlay this? So we've also showed this one on the channel as well, but it's been a few months, I think, since we showed this one. Because I don't think when I showed it, I don't think I actually thought that Bitcoin would go to 42K in January, to be completely honest. So what if we were, I probably should take it out a bit further. What if we were to draw it from this point all the way to here? Let's just draw it all the way through. And then we just move it and we overlay it. And you can see how closely it lines up. So this is a possibility, right? We have to admit it at least is a possibility. Whether it happens, time will tell. But if we were to extend this out and have it look something like that, we could maybe buy this. I think it's a possibility, just like the bullish case is a possibility. Just in the same manner that Bitcoin we've been moving down recently for the price of Bitcoin. Perhaps sometime in the next few weeks it breaks out and continues up and leaves this channel forever, and does what would be hard to somewhat imagine it doing in a very short period of time. Though a lot of people actually would imagine. A lot of people think that's what's going to happen. So this is scenario one. So let's actually put them both on the chart. Okay, let's put them both on the chart so we can look at both of them at the same time. So this is perspective one, where we're more or less doing something like this, and we're going to continue on up. And then the second perspective is if we take, say, intra-market cycle pattern and then just overlay it. So you ultimately get two very different patterns. One ultimately puts in the peak a lot earlier, and even if, again, we can experience diminishing returns and still put in a cycle peak earlier, right? I mean, it's possible that it goes to 100K later this year, and that's the cycle peak, and so then we'll look back at it and say, okay, well, diminishing returns happened, but the cycle didn't lengthen. The other possibility is that we are at a local top, or we were at a local top at 42K, and we ultimately trend back down, put in another bottom, we ride this trend line for a few hundred more days, and then we ultimately come back up to it, and maybe the next time we come back up to it, we'll be over 100K. So these are the two different patterns I think that are at least worth considering. The chances that either of these patterns play out exactly how we drew them are essentially completely negligible. But, the one thing we can say for sure is that the price will not exactly follow either of these patterns. Maybe it'll do something in between, right? Maybe it'll just do something like that. But the point is to say, if we get in this mindset that it can only go up or that it can only go down, it's a dangerous mindset to be in, because you really should consider all possibilities that could theoretically exist. Because, in one universe, if we live in a multiverse, in universe 1, maybe this happens. In universe 2, maybe this happens. Let's consider the different possibilities as we navigate the market cycle. So what would be interesting is, for the bullish case, then we could even calm down for a few months and still be ahead of the prior cycle. So from the bullish perspective, even if we cooled down for 2 or 3 months, we could still be on track, right? So I thought that was an interesting point, because you can see that the last time we reached that level of ROI from the bottom, obviously we're not at it now, but it would have been another 91 days from the time we reached it. So we were approximately 3 months ahead of schedule as measured from the ROI from the last market cycle bottom. Interesting point. The other interesting point for the bearish perspective is, well, what if we do something like this and we're chopping down here. I mean, this we're around this point already, around just over 30K or so. And sometimes Bitcoin will not rip the Band-Aid off. It can be a slow bleed rather than just ripping the Band-Aid off and getting it over with. And if it did do something like this, what would be somewhat interesting is that in September, it would still imply a $30,000 Bitcoin. And what would be interesting about that is that this past year, in October, it was really late September, early October, that Bitcoin went on this amazing run. So theoretically, it's possible that Bitcoin just does nothing for 9 months, hypothetically speaking, and it could still go to 100K by December if it were to put in another 4x, starting from 30K from, say, October, November, and December, and maybe early January. That would be, if we repeated this last year, that would be another 4x from a possible 30K in August. And from that point, if it just simply repeated the prior year, going up 4x, and we would get to over $100,000 Bitcoin. We get to $120,000 Bitcoin. What I think would be somewhat interesting is if we were at 30K in August, and basically people were ready to say, okay, it's the end of 2021. Everyone knows that, 4-year cycle theory and the idea that Bitcoin's going to go to 300K by the end of 2021 or 250K, whatever theory you're following, and everyone knows it, so it must happen, and it starts to go back up, and everyone's like, all right, it's time, who held, and then it just dumps, right? I mean, imagine if something like that were to happen. It would certainly go against, right, what at least a lot of the market thinks would happen. Now, seeing a capitulation like this would be pretty significant, and I have a hard time believing that we would dump to 11K in October of 2021. I have a hard time believing that would happen. Again, these bar patterns are just meant to illustrate different possibilities. They certainly do not definitively say what will happen. It's just overlaying two different bar patterns and seeing the bullish perspective and the bearish perspective. So what would be funny though is if it did this and then it could pop right back up to 20 or 30K, and then the people that thought, oh, it's gonna, it didn't go to 100K, therefore, what's the point? And then it continues to trend up, and then in 2022, maybe it does what people thought were going to happen in 2021. So we have the bullish case and we have the bearish case. You can pick a side. I think it's somewhat reasonable to remain somewhat flexible on exactly what will happen. It's really too early to know. Over the last few weeks, Bitcoin has been trending down. So if that breaks and we're able to start putting in new highs in, say, the next few months, and we're going to like 50K, 60K, 70K, then certainly it would give us more reason to think that we're more likely on track with a bullish perspective. However, if what has been happening for the last 3 weeks continues happening, which is basically the price of Bitcoin drops and then people get scared, and then it rallies, and then when it rallies, altcoins rally more, and then it goes sideways for a little bit, and then altcoins go crazy, and then Bitcoin dumps again, and it dumps lower than where it dumped the prior time, or at least it's putting in lower tops, and then people rationalize that, okay, well, now the price is at this other value, which last week would have been very bearish, but this week it's very bullish. Who's felt that way? I think a lot of people have felt that way because at one point we were at 42K, and then we dumped down to 30K. We went back up to 40K, and then everyone was super bullish at 40K. But then it went back down to back down into the low 30s. And then now we're at the point where it almost feels like a $32,000 Bitcoin. Now people are happy with that because at least it's not a $29,000 Bitcoin. It's kind of a similar thing as to what happened in 2019, where it slowly just kept going down for several months, and then it had this amazing rally about 6 months later, and then we actually had the COVID dump in March. So those are just a couple of observations that I think are fairly useful to look at on the chart, and if we continue this. And you see, say, rather than putting in new highs over the next few months, right? Imagine we don't go to 50K or 60K or 70K over the next, say, 6 months or something. And instead, Q1 is remembered as just a slow bleed of the price of Bitcoin. Then I think you would have to at least give more consideration to this perspective, right? So it's dangerous to say exactly which perspective will play out because we simply do not know. Obviously, it will likely not be either one of these specifically, but maybe something in between. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that subscribe button. Give the video a thumbs up. Also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. And as a final reminder, we have the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com if you're looking for exclusive content. If you're wanting more than what I present here, check it out, intothecryptoverse.com. We also have a lifetime deal going on for 5 more days. So the price for the lifetime deal will actually go up on February 1st. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure you check that link out in the description below. The bullish case, the bearish case. Let me know in the comments what you think is going to happen in 2021. Are you bullish? Are you bearish? Or do you think 2021 will actually be remembered as a boring accumulation year? Okay, let me know what you guys think about that in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.